Good morning. I'm Joe Welsh, Executive Director of the Lehigh Valley Justice Institute. And we had previously in yesterday's symposium expected to have Susan Wild, our former representative in Congress, as our keynote speaker. And she was unable to make it yesterday, but has graciously squeezed us in today.
Really?
And what can we say about Susan Wild?
Well, the bathroom was closed.
We're carrying the ball, Virgil. What can we say about Susan Wild? Susan Wild spent 6 years in the United States Congress as a fierce advocate for working families in the Lehigh Valley and in the nation. She worked specifically on funding for health care and, relevant to our symposium yesterday, funding for mental health care in particular. That is a strong interest of hers. She represented this district in a very much bipartisan way, addressing the common themes that run through all of our lives. We don't get up in the morning thinking we're a Democrat or thinking we're Republican. We get up in the morning thinking, how are we going to pay the rent? How are we going to pay the mortgage? How are we going to afford food? How are we going to put our kids through college? All of those questions. And they shouldn't be Democratic or Republican questions, but unfortunately they are. And that's why we need strong advocates in the mold of Susan Wild, representing real people in Congress and not the billionaire class. And so it is my great, great honor to introduce to you Susan Wild.
Good morning, everybody. And for anybody who was here yesterday, I apologize that I wasn't here. I was stricken by bad stomach issues is all I will say, that precluded me getting here. Fortunately, I'm feeling much better today. And thank you, Joe, for that very nice introduction. I'm going to start sort of at the end of what Joe said about the work that I did in a bipartisan manner. It's not really just about the work I did. What I quickly realized was that so many of the issues that I cared deeply about, particularly those that you've been talking about in this symposium, really have no political boundaries. When it comes to mental health issues, and I became a fierce advocate for improved mental health care across our country very early in my term in Congress when I had my own tragedy in my family. We lost a close family member to suicide very unexpectedly 5 months into my time in Congress. Not what I expected. And this was not just a family member, this was my partner of many, many years. And he was in contrast to many of the people that that are represented by this map and in other areas covered by Lehigh Valley Justice Institute, you would think that he should not have had a care in the world. He was financially comfortable. He was in his early 60s, white male, well-educated, successful business. And yet he died by suicide after years of battling with depression. I've spent years trying to figure out where it all came from, and I've kind of given that up. And, what I've realized is that none of us really know. And by the way, it came from a very nice family, good family support, that kind of thing. And what I came to realize was that we don't really have, unless we are professionals in the field, a real understanding of what drives mental health problems. And I don't know that we need to have a deep understanding of individuals' mental health problems, but what we do as a country need to understand is the vast array of circumstances that will lead to problems with people's mental health. I was on the House Education and Labor Committee, and the whole 6 years that I was there. And one of the most vivid memories I have was a hearing that we had on ACEs, which at the time I wasn't familiar with the term, adverse childhood experiences, as most of you know. And we had educator after educator testify to us about the kinds of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that contributed to difficulties with learning, that contributed to behavior issues that for so long have just been treated as, some kind of juvenile detention problem. Put the kid in detention or whatever. And, that's the way we've dealt with it for so long. Certainly when I was growing up, that's how we dealt with those things. And they started running through in their testimony the many things. We think of adverse childhood circumstances or experiences, but we don't really think about the vast array. So some of the more obvious ones, breakdown of their family unit, perhaps. But the death of a parent, even a grandparent's death, the incarceration of a parent, becoming homeless, which sadly is all too often experienced by our students in the Lehigh Valley and elsewhere. Imagine, and some of you may have lived it, imagine being homeless as a young student in elementary school or middle school. My God, middle school was rough enough, having to deal with that kind. I remember my biggest fear in middle school was that I wasn't wearing cool enough clothes and that somebody would mock me for my knockoff jeans that my father insisted my mother get at some cheap store rather than the real Levi's. My father was a child of the Depression, and we never forgot that. But imagine, not having a home and how you can possibly focus on what you're there for, the learning. And then you add to that things like hunger. And one of my deepest concerns right now in this time that we are in at the very moment, and I'm not going to get super political about this, but I will tell you that one of my greatest fears is that there are going to be cuts to the agriculture budget, which will directly affect not just our farmers, it will definitely affect them, but our students who have the advantage of a hot meal for breakfast and lunch in Allentown School District and several other school districts without proof needing to be shown that they quote unquote deserve it. And that is huge. There are kids that depend on getting a backpack with some food items in it on a Friday afternoon when they go home for the weekend because of the lack of food in their own household. And to me, that probably stands out along with homelessness as the number one adverse childhood experience. So that was something that very early in my time in Congress, we had that hearing. And it really stuck with me. And I started talking to the schools, to superintendents, principals, and that kind of thing about how were they dealing here, the ones here, because these were experts from all over the country. And what I quickly learned was that the resources that they had to help students were far too little. I remember in one of our wealthier school districts, a superintendent telling me they had one school counselor in the elementary level that went between 6 different schools. So how do you possibly form any kind of individual relationship with students when you're seeing 6 schools, one person in a normal work week? So that has always troubled me, because what I don't think, I'm just going to say people, I'm not going to characterize politics or anything else. I don't think people understand the long-term consequences of these kinds of experiences early in life. It's very easy when you hear about a criminal case that goes to trial and perhaps a heinous crime is committed and a jury convicts, or a jury is deliberating about the defendant's fate. And you often will hear mitigating evidence, from that person's defense lawyer about something that happened in childhood, sexual abuse, childhood abuse, all kinds of things. And for the most part, these are adult defendants. And my experience, and I was never a criminal lawyer. I was a lawyer for 30 years before I came to Congress, but I did not do criminal work. But my experience and what I've read and learned is that juries, for the most part, don't spend a lot of time thinking about what happened to that person early in life. And I can kind of understand it, because what they are faced with is the evidence in that courtroom about whatever the crime was that was committed and what the appropriate punishment is if the person is convicted. And it's very hard to excuse really bad conduct for something that happened 20 years previous or longer. So, but it does create, and getting back to what I wish people would think more about, is the effect over the long haul on our society. And not just our society, this is a worldwide issue, but on our society. And, when somebody does not do well in elementary school, chances are they're not, unless they get a great mentor somewhere along the way that takes them under their wing and kind of shepherds them through. Chances are they're not going to do well in middle school. They're not going to do well in high school. They may drop out. They will then perhaps try to find a job, not very successfully, especially if they haven't finished high school. And if they do, it's not going to pay much. And then where does that lead us? Not everybody. And I'm not suggesting that this happens to everybody, but it increases the chances of that person engaging perhaps in petty crime, shoplifting, something like that, and often into the drug world. And one thing leads to another. And then before you know it, you have somebody who's facing a jury of his or her peers, supposed peers, and potentially going to prison for what could be a very long time. And I don't even, what happens in prison and the fact that very little rehabilitation goes on is deeply concerning as well. And I just have to digress for a moment and say, when you ever hear, I'm deeply against the privatization of what I call essential services. So postal service, by the way, something that is guaranteed in the Constitution. It's not intended to be a for-profit business. Privatizing the postal service would definitely mean that all of us will end up with crappy postal options, reduced service, and higher prices. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. Another essential service is prisons. Whether you think of them as an essential service or not, for our society, it's an essential service. But if you privatize the penal system, what you end up with is the profit motive. And that brings us to and you may have spoken about this yesterday, Joe, I don't know. I'm sorry, I should have gotten briefed on yesterday's proceedings. But that brings us to that horrible case of Kids for Cash in our state, just a couple hours north, in the Luzerne County Courthouse. Everybody familiar with Kids for Cash? It looks like some might not be. I used to try cases up there. I tried mostly my cases in Lehigh and Northampton County, but I went to Luzerne County periodically. There were a couple of judges there, one of whom I appeared in front of many times and liked a lot, who were taking cash for ordering that kids be placed in a private detention center for minor infractions. And when I say minor infractions, I'm not even talking about shoplifting. I'm talking about kids who truancy, didn't make it to school for a repeated number of days. And you can imagine, if you don't have a home or a place to call home, that not making it to school on multiple days is probably something that happens all too often. Chewing gum in class, there were real cases of kids who were brought before the court for multiple violations of the no chewing gum in class rule, and similar types of infractions for which these judges, and I don't know how they can live with themselves to this day, they're both alive, would send these kids to a private detention facility. They would get cash back from the owner and operator of this private detention facility. And these kids, most of whom had parents who could not afford a good lawyer, didn't have any idea how to navigate the legal system. And of course, they had been told by a judge wearing black robes that their kids were bad kids. And so these kids were often confined for long periods of time. Thankfully, eventually, it came to light. Both of these judges were convicted and were sentenced to very long terms. I was very happy about that. Sadly, in the final days of President Biden's administration, one of those two judges was pardoned. And he wasn't pardoned on the merits of anything. He was pardoned. Is it pardoned? That's probably the wrong.
His sentence was commuted.
His sentence was commuted. Thank you. Because he was one of the many people who during COVID, at the peak of COVID, had been sent home with home detention, with ankle bracelet, that kind of thing. And they had never incorporated most of those people back into the system. They were considered low risk and so forth. So he actually had his sentence commuted and is now home somewhere in Luzerne County, enjoying life, I guess. While the children, and I'm going to call them children because most of them were indeed children, are suffering the lifelong ramifications of being A, convicted in a courtroom, B, separated from their families, C, put in a private detention center that was in no means a rehabilitative place. And those people, although some of them will overcome that experience, will have lifelong scars related to that. That brings me to why I feel so strongly about the mission of Lehigh Valley Justice Institute. And I'm so glad that, is it an institute or initiative? Institute, thank you. You'll also have to forgive me. I'm having terrible problems with my contacts today, so everybody's a big blur. So if I know you, you're gonna have to come up close and say hi. I'm sorry. So that kind of makes you a little disconcerted. But the work that is done by LVJI is so essential. And it's thankless work in many cases, unless you count thanks as being doing the right thing and working for good. I mean, there is thanks in that. It's not usually financial reward. Many people in our society don't even understand why somebody would work in this field. You know, and the last example I'm going to give you, and I know that LVJI has been active in this, is cash bail and what that does to a person. Cash bail is when somebody is remanded to prison until they can post their bond or their bail. That often happens in the case of failure to pay child support. And while there are probably plenty of cases of people that fail to pay child support because they literally don't have the money, or who do have the money but just refuse to, and I don't have much sympathy for them. The people who don't pay their child support because they simply don't have the money and who are then remanded to jail and kept there, guess what happens to whatever job they have, if they have one? First of all, they're not going to be able to go out and get a job so they can pay their back support. Secondly, if they have a job, they're going to lose their job. And so the idea of, in these nonviolent crimes, requiring cash bail before somebody can be released is really unconscionable. And it's something that one of our judges in Northampton County spoke out about years ago, and I was incredibly, Judge Barada spoke out about it a very long time ago, and he's now the district attorney in Northampton County. And, you know, I didn't know that he had those views, but I was very glad he did. But that is a subject that if you bring it up on a political stage, somebody running for office, if I brought up what I just said and argued against cash bail, I would immediately be labeled as a person who is against public safety. And it would be far worse than that. Nasty commercials would ensue and so forth. We as a society do not embrace the idea enough of people's adverse experiences, both early in life and later in life. We don't understand because it's not that everybody's expected to be a scholar of this, but we all need to open our minds and our brains and listen. And those of us who are in a position to talk about it and go out into the community and educate people about this, as LVJI does, is incredibly important. One of my most memorable meetings when I was a member of Congress, Joe came to my office along with, who'd you come with? Marvin, I think? Yeah. And spoke of the work that LVJI was doing. And it really stuck with me as I went through multiple hearings in my time in Congress that involved all kinds of situations. Another, people do desperate things when they're faced with desperate circumstances. We as a country need to do a better job of making sure that people aren't in those desperate circumstances to begin with. So that, and that's where you would really find greater public safety, I would argue. But I'm not on a debate stage, thankfully. And I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words, and I just appreciate your being here and listening. And most of all, I appreciate the work that Lehigh Valley Justice Institute does. Thank you.